"I needed the money yesterday," my son said, and he slid his wife's debt across my kitchen table like it was a phone bill. $325,000. "Don't disappoint me, Mom," Trevor added, and his voice was cold. I just smiled and poured him more coffee while he scrolled through his phone. 6 hours later, my account was at zero. When he came back that evening for the money, he found the house empty and a single envelope on the table. When he opened it, he went pale. I had been a quiet woman for 68 years. He never once imagined that the quiet woman had been counting. The doorbell rang at 7:30 on an ordinary Tuesday morning. 3 sharp rings, one after another, like the world was ending. I already knew who it was before I reached the door. My son only ever showed up without warning when he needed something. I left my half-full cup of tea on the counter and walked slowly down the hall. Through the front windows, I could see his car in the driveway, a heavy black SUV parked at an angle across the gravel, one wheel crushing the edge of my flower bed. Trevor had inherited his father's hunger for money. He had inherited none of his father's patience. And that was almost a mercy, because his father's patience had been the cruelest thing about him. When I opened the door, he was already talking into his phone. A thick brown envelope was tucked under his arm. His face was tense, and in that tension I saw Gerald so clearly that for a moment I forgot my husband had been dead for 10 years. "Mom," Trevor said, stepping past me without a hug, just a quick kiss at the air near my cheek. "We need to talk." He walked straight into the kitchen like the house was still his, though he had moved out almost 20 years ago. He sat down in my chair. He set the envelope on the table. He started checking his phone again while I stood in the doorway and watched him. "A coffee would be great," he said without looking up. I made the coffee the way I had made 10,000 coffees. 10 years a widow, and I still served the men in my life as if it were the only thing I was for. When I set the mug in front of him, I noticed how tight his hands were, the knuckles white as he typed. "Is Danielle all right?" I asked. "And the kids?" I was talking about my daughter-in-law and my 2 grandchildren, Cody and Paige, the grandchildren I was almost never allowed to see. "They're fine," Trevor said, vague as smoke. He finally put the phone down and took a sip. "I'll get right to it, Mom. I have a problem." I sat down across from him. On the wall, the old clock ticked slow and heavy. "Danielle got herself into a bad situation," he said, and he pushed the envelope toward me. "She made some investments that fell apart. She trusted the wrong people." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside there were bank statements, collection notices, and a private loan agreement with one number circled in red. $325,000. My heart went sideways. It was almost everything I had. It was my savings and the money left from the sale of the condo downtown after Gerald died, the little glass box of a life I had built alone in the 10 years since. "Trevor," I said, and my throat had gone dry. "This is nearly everything I own." He drank his coffee. His eyes came up and settled on me flat and calm. "Mom, it's not like you need it," he said. "You live alone in a paid-off house. Your expenses are nothing. And for God's sake, you're 68 years old. What exactly are you saving it for?" The words landed like a hand across my face. I did not tell him that the house was not mine, that it had been put in his name years ago. One more decision Gerald made about my life without asking me to keep things simple, he had said to avoid trouble later. The house I had lived in for 30 years was legally my son's, and my son knew it. "It isn't that simple," I said. "I have my medications, my appointments, my own old age to think about." Trevor tapped the table twice, cutting me off the way his father used to. "It's just a bad stretch, Mom. Danielle trusted the wrong person, that's all. If this doesn't get paid by tomorrow," and here he stopped and took a slow breath, "things are going to get ugly. These aren't the kind of lenders you send a polite letter to. They're not patient people." "What kind of people?" I asked, and my voice was barely there. "You don't need the details," he said. "Just trust me. It's a loan. I'll pay you back the second the company reorganizes." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my son's face. I looked at the back door that led to the yard where he used to dig for worms after the rain, a small boy in yellow boots laughing. Now a stranger sat in my kitchen wearing that boy's grown face. "You've asked me for loans before, Trevor," I said. "I never saw that money again. 100,000 for the expansion. 50,000 for the supplier problem." His jaw hardened. "This is serious, Mom. This isn't the time for one of your moods." He stood up and started pacing the kitchen like something caged. "I'm your only son. I'm your family. You always said you'd do anything for me. There it was. The oldest lever in the house, the one Gerald had installed, and Trevor had learned to pull before he was tall enough to reach the counter. Family, the word that had bent me my whole life. I need to think, I said quietly. There's no time to think, Trevor said, and his voice climbed. I need the money in my account before end of day. Tomorrow is too late. He came around the table and stopped behind my chair and put his hands on my shoulders. They were heavy. They felt like the lid of something closing. Mom, he said, and now the voice went soft, which was always worse. You know I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death. It's for Danielle. It's for our family. Family. The magic word. The spell that had always worked, that made me fold and give and shrink. All right, I said. I'll transfer it. The relief on his face was almost obscene. He smiled for the first time since he walked in, and for one terrible second, the smile belonged to the boy in the yellow boots, and my chest ached with a love that had nowhere left to go. Thank you, Mom, he said. I knew I could count on you. He looked at his watch. I've got a meeting, but I'll come back tonight, and we'll get it all squared away. Deal. I nodded because I could not speak. He picked up the envelope, kissed the top of my head, and headed for the door. Don't disappoint me, Mom, he said again on his way out, as if I were the child and he were the parent. The door shut. I sat alone in the kitchen with his half-finished coffee cooling in front of me and the certainty settling into my bones that I had just agreed to a terrible thing. Through the window, I watched his car tear out of the driveway, spraying gravel across the flower bed I had knelt in the dirt to plant. And then I did something I had not done in years. I did not cry, and I did not start the transfer. I sat very still, and I picked up the envelope he had left behind, because in his hurry to be relieved, Trevor had left me the whole file. I am going to tell you something about myself that Trevor never bothered to learn. Before I married Gerald, before I was anyone's wife or anyone's mother, I kept books. Not the reading kind, the accounting kind. I worked 3 days a week for a lumber supplier and a dentist and a small church, and I was good at it, good enough that the dentist once told me I could see a lie in a ledger, the way other people could smell smoke. Then I married Gerald, and Gerald preferred a wife who did not look too closely at numbers, and over 32 years I let that part of me go quiet. I told myself I had forgotten how. I had not forgotten how. You never really do. So I sat at my kitchen table, and instead of picking up the phone to move my money, I picked up the papers and I started to read them the way the dentist taught me all those years ago. Slowly, line by line, following the money instead of the story. And within 20 minutes, the room had gone cold around me because the numbers were not saying what my son had said. The loan agreement in red was real, but it was not the first page of the story. It was the last. Behind it, buried in the stack Trevor had shoved at me in his hurry, were photocopies of other documents. A credit line I had never opened. A second loan against something, though I could not yet tell what. And on 2 of the pages down at the bottom, in the place where a person signs her name, was my name, Rochelle Whitcomb, signed in a hand that was almost mine. Almost. The R was wrong. I have made that R the same way for 60 years, a little closed loop at the top, and whoever wrote this had left it open. It was close. It was practiced. It was not me. I set the page down very carefully, as if it might go off. My son had not come to me that morning to borrow money. He had come to collect on a debt he had already built in my name, and the $325,000 was not a loan I was giving. It was the hole he needed me to fill so that no one would ever pull these pages out and look at the R. I sat with that for a long time, and a strange thing happened. The fear I had lived inside my whole life, the fear of Gerald's cold voice and Trevor's cold eyes, did not get bigger. It got smaller, and something else moved into the space where it had been. I did not have a word for it yet. Later I would learn to call it clarity. I picked up the phone. I did not dial my son. I dialed a number I had not used in almost a year, a number I knew by heart anyway. Vivian, I said when she answered. It's Rochelle. I need your help, and I need you to come now, and I need you to bring the part of your brain that reads contracts. Vivian Ashford and I met in a typing class 46 years ago and never quite let go of each other. She went to law school. I went to the altar. She spent 4 decades quietly disapproving of that choice, and never once saying so out loud, which is a rarer kind of friendship than people think. She pulled into my driveway 35 minutes later, and by the time she had her coat off, she was already reading over my shoulder. $325,000, she said, and she said it slowly. Rochelle. That's everything. I know, I said. And it's not the half of it. Look at the R. She looked at the R. She was quiet for a moment, and then she took off her reading glasses and folded them and looked at me the way I imagined she looked at a jury. How long has this been going on? She asked. I don't know yet, I said. That's the point. I've been handing him money for years and calling it love. 100 here, 50 there. I never asked where it went because asking would have meant admitting what I already knew. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. And you knew, she said. Not a question. I knew, I said. I always knew. His father was exactly the same, and I trained myself for 30 years not to see it. And then I trained my son that his mother was a woman who wouldn't look. Well, Vivian said. She squeezed my hand. Look now. So we looked. We spread every page across my kitchen table under the light, and for 2 hours we built a picture of what my son had done. The red loan was the newest. But the forged pages went back further, and there was a reference on one of them to an account I had never heard of at a bank I had never used. Vivian tapped it with one finger. This, she said, is not a loan gone bad. This is fraud. This is a pattern. And the man who built it is coming back to your house at dinner time, expecting you to have wired him $333,000 to bury it. The clock ticked. Outside the dahlias I had planted alone after Gerald died moved in a small wind red and heavy on their stems. I had grown them out of poor soil through 3 failed summers, and they had bloomed anyway, and every year I looked at them and thought, well, if they can. I looked at them now. What do you want to do? Vivian asked, and I heard the lawyer step back in her voice and let my oldest friend ask it instead. I could feel the shape of the answer before I had the words, and when the words came, they did not shake. I want to move every dollar I have where he can't reach it, I said. I want it out of every account he knows about before end of day, because he thinks I'm transferring it to him, and he won't check until tonight. And then I said I want to be gone from this house before he comes back to it. Vivian looked at me, and then a slow smile broke across her face, the smile of a woman who has waited a very long time for a friend to arrive. Rochelle Whitcomb, she said, I have been waiting 46 years to hear you say a sentence like that. She reached for her phone. I have a house in Charleston that sits empty most of the year. Ocean side of the peninsula. Quiet. How long do we have? He said he'd be back for dinner, I said. Call it 10 hours. She checked her watch. That's plenty. Here's the order of the day. Bank first, and not your bank, a new account somewhere clean. Then my office so you can sign a power of attorney to me, a real one, so that from this afternoon on the only person who can act in your name is a person who is on your side. Then we pack a bag and we drive. I want to say I felt only strength. I did not. Underneath the clarity, the old fear was still there, small and cold, and it spoke up now in its small, cold voice. He's going to be furious, I said more to myself than to her. Vivian took both my hands. Rochelle, she said, are you afraid of him? I thought about Trevor's face when he did not get what he wanted, the way the softness dropped out of it, the way his eyes went to his father's eyes. Yes, I said, the same way I was afraid of his father for 30 years. Then it is time, Vivian said gently, to stop being afraid of dead men and the sons they leave behind. Go pack. I went to my bedroom and pulled down the suitcase I had used twice in 10 years. I opened the closet and reached for the clothes, and then I stopped because I realized I did not want much of that life. Just the plain things. A few sweaters, my good shoes, my medications lined up in their orange bottles, the folder of documents I would need. At the back of the bottom dresser drawer there was a small wooden box, and in the box was the only money Gerald never knew. I had a few $1,000s saved a little at a time over the years from the pottery I used to sell at the church fair before he made me stop because it embarrassed him to have a wife who sold things. My small secret, my small rebellion. It had been waiting 30 years for a day like this one. I took the framed photo of my mother. I picked up the photo of Trevor at 7, the yellow boots, the gap in his teeth, and I held it for a long moment. Then I set it back down on the dresser, face up, and I left it there. That boy was real. He had simply not survived the house he grew up, in the same house that had almost not let me survive it either. I would not carry his picture into my new life. But I would not throw it away either. I closed the drawer on it gently the way you close a door on a room where someone is sleeping. When I came back down the hall with my one suitcase, Vivian was off the phone. Bank opens the account in an hour, she said. The Charleston house is aired out and waiting." She looked at the suitcase, then at me. "What are you going to leave for him?" she asked. I thought about it. "Some kind of explanation," I said. And then I shook my head. No, not an explanation. A note. And a lesson he should have learned from me 30 years ago and never did. At the bank, the manager was a careful young man who did not like moving large sums quickly, and I did not blame him. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "are you certain?" "It's a considerable amount." "I am certain," I said, and I signed where he pointed. "I need this account tied to a new mailing address, not my home, and I need it clear that no one holds any authority over it but me and the attorney named in these papers." He looked at Vivian, who slid her documents across the desk with the calm of a woman who does this in her sleep, and after that, he stopped asking. As the transfer processed, Vivian leaned close. "Where's the money going to live long term?" she murmured. "Somewhere he has never heard of," I said, "and somewhere I understand." I opened a second account that morning at a credit union across town, a small one, the kind of place Trevor would never think to look, because it was too modest to hold anything he thought was worth stealing. That was the point. We drove back to the house one last time. I sat at the kitchen table where I had served that man his coffee 3 hours before, and I took a clean sheet of paper and I thought about what to write. I did not write that I loved him, though I did. I did not write that I forgave him because I had not yet. I wrote the truest sentence I had. I am the one who is disappointed, and underneath it, I wrote I looked at the R. That was all. 6 words in a sentence. He would understand the R. It would tell him that I had read the pages, that I knew that the quiet woman had been counting after all, and that there was no story he could tell tonight that I had not already read the ending of. I left the note in the center of the table, weighted down with his cold coffee cup so it would not blow away. I picked up my suitcase. At the door, I turned and looked back at the house that had been my address for 30 years and never once my own. Through the window, the dahlias burned red in the afternoon light, standing up straight out of soil that was never meant to grow them, and I thought, all right then. Me too. Then I stepped out and pulled the door shut behind me, and for the first time in my life, the sound of that door closing did not frighten me. It set me free. In the car, as we pulled onto the road and the house shrank in the mirror and finally slid out of sight, Vivian reached over and took my hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. I looked out the window at the town going by 30 years of a small, quiet, obedient life sliding past the glass. "No," I said, and I was surprised to hear how steady my own voice was. "But I'm going to be." And somewhere behind us, 100 miles and several hours away, a man in a black SUV was sitting in a meeting, glancing at his watch, certain that his mother was at home doing what his mother always did, which was exactly what she was told. Charleston smelled like salt and cut grass and something green I could not name. Vivian's house sat 3 blocks back from the harbor, a narrow old thing painted the color of butter with a porch that ran the length of it and a ceiling fan that turned slow all day whether you asked it to or not. That first night I sat on the porch and listened to the water move against the seawall, and I turned my phone over in my hands the way you turn over a stone you are not sure you want to look under. When I finally checked it, there were 19 missed calls from Trevor. I turned the phone off again. I was not ready. I was not sure I would ever be ready, and I gave myself permission sitting there in the dark with the fan turning to not be ready for a while. "He'll find you eventually," Vivian said. She came out with 2 glasses of wine and set one by my hand. "He knows I have property. It won't take him long to connect us. We need more than a hiding place, Rochelle. We need a plan that works whether he finds you or not." I nodded. Strangely, I felt calm. "I never thought I'd have the nerve to do a thing like this," I said. "I always knew you had the nerve," Vivian said. "You just needed a reason bigger than your fear." She raised her glass. "To the R," she said, and I laughed for the first time in what felt like years, and the sound surprised me, and a little of the tightness went out of my chest. The calls did not stop. Over the next few days, they came in waves. Trevor's number, then Danielle's, then a number I did not know that turned out to be my own sister Ruth, who had clearly been recruited to find me. I listened to a few of the voicemails and then stopped because they told me everything I needed to know about the man I had raised. In one, he was soft and frightened. "Mom, please just call me. I'm worried sick. This isn't like you." In the next one, left 40 minutes later, the softness was gone. "You can't just vanish," he said. "The house is in my name. Remember that? Think very carefully about what you're doing." There it was, the whole of him in 2 messages, the plea and the threat, the same weather Gerald used to move through in the space of a single dinner. I did not call back. Instead, I built a life one small, ordinary piece at a time, because I had read somewhere long ago that the opposite of fear is not courage, it is routine. I found a market near the waterfront where people sold what they made, and I signed up for a half table, and I dug my old hands back into the one thing that had always been mine. I bought a second-hand wheel and a bag of stoneware clay, and I sat in Vivian's back room with a towel over my lap, and I made bowls. Ugly ones at first. My hands had forgotten what my heart remembered. But by the end of the second week, the bowls stopped fighting me, and I glazed them in the colors of that coast oyster, gray and marsh green, and a blue like the harbor at 6 in the morning, and people at the market picked them up and turned them over and paid me actual money for them, and every dollar felt like it weighed more than the dollars Trevor had taken. Because these were mine, made by a woman with a name. I signed up for a swim class at the community pool, the kind they run for people my age at 7 in the morning when the water is cold and honest. I learned the names of the other swimmers. I let a woman named Patsy talk me into coffee afterward, and I sat in a diner with strangers and laughed at things, and no one at that table knew me as anyone's widow, or anyone's mother, or anyone's bank. They knew me as Rochelle, who made the gray bowls and could not do the backstroke to save her life. It was the first time in decades that a room full of people knew only the parts of me I had chosen to show them. Vivian stayed most of that first stretch working her cases by phone from the butter yellow house, and it was she who became my eyes back home. It was Vivian who told me one evening over the phone from her office in Minneapolis that Trevor had come to see her. He was out of his mind, she said. Showed up at reception without an appointment, demanding to know where you were. Said you weren't in your right mind, that you'd been manipulated by, and here she paused, by me, apparently. Said he was going to have you declared incompetent and brought home. What did you tell him? I asked. My hand had gone still on the phone. I told him you were the most competent person I'd represented all year, Vivian said, and that if he threatened you again, I'd file for a restraining order and let a judge decide who in your family had a competence problem. She let that sit. He went red, Rochelle. Purple nearly. I don't think anyone has stood in that man's way in his whole adult life. The letter came at the end of the first month. It arrived at Vivian's office, forwarded to me in a thick envelope, and it was from a lawyer named Dennis Halloway, writing on Trevor's behalf. It was a careful, expensive sort of letter, and underneath the careful language it said one ugly thing. Trevor intended to petition the court for a conservatorship over me. He would ask a judge to find that his 68-year-old mother could no longer manage her own money and to hand control of that money to him, her devoted and concerned son. Tucked into the same envelope in different handwriting was a short note from Danielle. Rochelle, it said, please come back. He's out of control. The lenders are calling the house. I don't know what to do. We need you. I read the note from Danielle 3 times, and I thought about a young woman alone in a house with a man who was coming apart, and my grandchildren in their rooms listening to it, and something in me that had gone very still for many years began slowly to move. I gave both documents to Vivian, and Vivian went to work, and this is where I learned that my oldest friend had spent 40 years becoming a weapon I had never once thought to ask for. To beat a conservatorship petition, she told me you do not argue that the person is fine. You prove it coldly on paper so completely that no judge will waste a morning on it. So she arranged for me to be evaluated by a geriatrician in Charleston, a thorough woman who spent 2 hours testing my memory and my reasoning and my grasp of my own finances, and who wrote a report that said in the flat language of medicine that Rochelle Whitcomb showed no cognitive impairment of any kind and was entirely capable of managing her own affairs. And then Vivian did the thing that mattered more. She took my file, the pages Trevor had left on my table, and she built a timeline, a plain, unglamorous list of every dollar my son had moved through my accounts over the years, and she attached it to the report. The message to the court, if it ever got that far, was simple. This is not a confused old woman who needs her son to protect her money. This is a competent woman whose money her son has been taking. It never got that far. Dennis Halloway received the evaluation and the timeline, and within a week the conservatorship threat quietly evaporated the way a bully's fist unclenches when he realizes the small person in front of him has friends. That was the first fight, and I won it. And I want to be honest about how it felt. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like a door I had been leaning against my whole life had finally been locked from my side, and I stood there with my back to it, breathing amazed that it had held. But winning that fight is what pushed me to open the next door, and behind the next door was the thing that changed everything. Because in building her timeline, Vivian had been working only from the pages Trevor left behind, and I could not stop thinking about the account on that one document the bank I had never used. If there was one account I did not know about, I thought there could be more. So one gray morning, I sat down at Vivian's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, the way another cup had gone cold on another table a lifetime ago, and I did the thing no one had ever taught me I was allowed to do. I pulled my own credit report. All 3 of them. My full financial life laid out by strangers who had no reason to lie. It took me most of the morning to understand what I was looking at, and when I understood it, I had to put the pages down and walk out to the porch and stand in the cold air until my hands stopped shaking. The $325,000 loan was not the crime. It was the bandage. Underneath it, going back nearly 9 years, was a second life I had never lived, a financial ghost wearing my name. There was the credit line I had found on Trevor's pages. But there were others. 2 more cards I had never applied for. A store account. And most of all, there was a home equity loan taken against a house drawn nearly to its limit that I traced with a cold and growing certainty to the very house I had lived in for 30 years. The house that was in Trevor's name, borrowed against using documents that carried a signature almost like mine. My son had not simply asked me for money over the years. He had built a fake version of me out of paper, a Rochelle who signed whatever he needed signed, and he had been feeding that paper woman to his creditors for the better part of a decade. And then I found the oldest thread, and it went cold all the way down. 9 years ago, right around the time Gerald got sick and then died, right when I was too destroyed by grief to read anything. I was handed Trevor had brought me a stack of documents to sign. For your protection, Mom, in case something happens and you need help. One of them, he said, was a durable power of attorney, so that if I ever became unable to handle my own affairs, my loving son could step in. I signed it in a kitchen that smelled like funeral flowers, my hand moving where his finger pointed, and I never read a word. That power of attorney had never expired, and Trevor had used it over and over legally to open some of those accounts in my name while forging my signature on the others when the power of attorney would not stretch far enough. Half of what he had done to me, he had done with a pen I put in his hand myself on the worst week of my life. I could have drowned in the shame of that. I sat on the porch, and for a while I let it come, the whole tide of it, all the times I had not looked all the papers I had signed for Gerald and then for Trevor. Because looking closely felt like an accusation, and I had been trained to keep the peace. And then the tide went back out the way tides do, and left something hard and clean behind on the sand of me. Because here is what I understood sitting there. A confused woman drowns in that shame. A woman who kept books does not. She reaches for a pen of her own. I went back inside, and I called Vivian, and I did not cry, and I told her what I had found, and there was a silence on the line, and then my friend the weapon said, "All right, now we don't hide. Now we go on offense. We did it in order the way you clear a debt, oldest first." That afternoon I signed and had notarized a revocation of the durable power of attorney, and Vivian sent formal notice of it to every institution named in my credit report, so that from that day forward the paper Rochelle was dead, and only the real one could act. Then, one account at a time, I did the thing that a fraud victim is actually entitled to do, and that no one had ever told me I could. I filed an identity theft report with the police. I completed the affidavits. I disputed every account I had never opened in writing with the credit bureaus, and I attached the report, and I made the institutions do the work of proving the debts were mine, which they could not, because they were not. It was slow. It was tedious. It was the most powerful thing I have ever done, sitting at a kitchen table with a pen, unmaking a woman my son had built to rob me, and building the real one back in her place, line by line, the way you balance a ledger that someone has spent 9 years trying to hide. And then Vivian said the sentence that turned my private housekeeping into a reckoning. "This is enough," she said, "to do more than clean up your credit. This is a criminal file, Rochelle. Forged signatures. Accounts opened by fraud. A power of attorney used far outside its bounds. You are not just a woman fixing her own name. You are a witness with evidence. I want your permission to take all of it to the Financial Crimes Unit at the County Attorney's Office." I stood in Vivian's kitchen and looked out at the marsh going gold in the late light, and I thought about the boy in the yellow boots, and I thought about the man who left his address as collateral, and I understood that those had become 2 different people, and that I was allowed to grieve one and stop protecting the other. "Take it," I said. "All of it. I am done paying to keep his secrets." That was the choice that made everything after it possible. And I want you to notice that I made it. Not a detective who stumbled onto Trevor. Not luck. Me, a 68-year-old woman who had been told her whole life that she was no good with money, sat down with the numbers and followed them all the way to the truth, and then carried the truth to the law herself. Everything that happened to my son after that, he set in motion the morning he handed me a file in a hurry. But the hand that opened the file and read it and did not look away was mine. The detective work back home was slow, and while it turned, my other life kept growing. The gray bowls sold. Patsy from the pool talked me into helping at a fundraiser, and I found I was good at it, standing up in front of people telling a plain, true story until strangers reached for their wallets. And then one afternoon, 2 months after I left Minneapolis, there was a knock at the butter yellow door, and I opened it to find my daughter-in-law standing on the porch, pale and thin, with a suitcase and a face full of fear. "How did you find me?" I asked. "We hired someone," Danielle said, looking down. "A skip tracer. Trevor doesn't know. I came alone. Can I come in?" I hesitated because I had learned to hesitate. Then I looked at how thin she was, and I stepped back and let her in. She stood in Vivian's cozy front room and looked around at the gray bowls on the shelf and the clay under my fingernails, and something in her face broke a little. "It's yours, isn't it?" she said. "This whole life. You made it. All of it," I said. We sat on the porch, and I made her a plate of food and watched her eat it like she had not eaten properly in weeks. "Things are bad, Rochelle," she said finally. "He's not himself. Or maybe he finally is himself, and I never let myself see it. He sold my car. He's trying to sell the lake house. The lenders call at all hours. And it isn't just the money he owes them. There's more. There was always more. His father was the same," I said. "Another debt behind the debt. Always." She looked at me and her eyes filled. "He told them," she said. "The lenders. He told them you have money hidden away. He told them where you used to live." A cold finger ran down my spine. "Did he offer me to them?" I asked. Danielle did not answer. Her silence was the answer, and it was loud. I took her hands across the table the way Vivian had once taken mine. "You have to get out of that house," I said. "You and Cody and Paige. Take them to your mother's." "It's not that simple," she whispered. "He controls everything, the accounts, the passwords, the kids' documents. I don't know how to leave." I looked at this frightened young woman, and I saw myself at 30, at 40, at 50, saying those exact words in that exact voice, and I understood at last that the cruelest part of a cage is that it teaches you to call it a house. "I know you don't know how," I said gently. "I didn't know how for 30 years. Nobody knew how until they did." And then I said the thing I had needed someone to say to me my whole life, and had never heard and had finally learned to say to myself. You don't have to know the whole way out. You only have to take the first step and let the people who love you hold the light. "I can't give you money, Danielle. I won't, because money is the string he pulls, and I'm done being pulled. But I can help you leave. I can help you and the children get out of that house and stay out. That I can do." She looked at me with such a raw and complicated hope that I had to look away out at the marsh where the tide was turning again, coming in this time patient and certain. "He'll find us," she said, "like he found you. Then we'll be ready when he does," I said, and I heard in my own voice a steadiness I had never owned before. "But first we get you and those children somewhere safe. After that we let the law do the thing the law is finally getting ready to do." She stayed the night in the spare room. I sat up late on the porch after she was asleep, listening to the water, and I thought about the file traveling toward the county attorney's office, and the paper woman I had finally killed, and the 2 grandchildren I was about to help pull out of a burning house. And I was not calm anymore, not exactly. But under the fear there was something with a spine to it, and it held me up. Somewhere to the north, a man who had spent his life being certain his mother would do what she was told was about to learn how wrong he had always been. And this time when the reckoning came for him, it would not come as luck or as fate or as some stranger's investigation. It would come with my name on the paperwork in the real handwriting, with the closed loop at the top of the R that no one had ever managed to copy. The call came on a Thursday from a Minnesota number I did not recognize, and for one cold second, I thought it was Trevor using someone else's phone. It was not. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the voice said, calm and even. "My name is Susan Brennan. I'm an investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit at the County Attorney's Office. I believe you know why I'm calling." I sat down slowly on Vivian's porch steps. "I do," I said. "I sent you a great deal of paper." "You did," she said, and there was something almost warm in it. It's the most organized victim file I've seen in 9 years on this desk. Most people bring me a shoebox and a lot of crying. You brought me a timeline. I would like to talk about your son. We talked for an hour that first day, and many hours after. Susan Brennan asked careful questions, and I gave careful answers. And slowly between us, the ghost woman Trevor had built came fully into the light. Brennan understood the distinction that mattered, the one Vivian had drilled into me. There were transactions Trevor had made while holding my power of attorney, and those were a betrayal of trust, a breach of the duty that pen was supposed to carry. And then there were the documents where the power of attorney would not reach where he had needed my actual signature, and did not have it, and had simply drawn one. Those were forgery. Those were a different animal with a different set of years attached to it. He crossed a line, Brennan told me, the day he stopped using the authority you gave him and started inventing authority you never gave. That line is the whole case. I gave my formal statement over a secure video call, Vivian at my shoulder, and I told the truth about all of it. The loans, the promises, the pressure, the power of attorney I signed in a house that smelled of funeral flowers. I told her about the R. And then Brennan told me something that stopped my breath. We've been building this out from your file, she said, and it's bigger than your accounts. Your son leveraged the house, Mrs. Whitcomb, the one in his name. He took a private loan against it, and when the equity ran out, he went to the kind of lenders who don't file paperwork with the state. And he gave them something to make them feel secure. He gave them you. He told them his mother had money and property, and he gave them your former address, and he told them if he couldn't pay, they knew where to find her. I want to tell you I was surprised. I was not. Danielle had already put the shape of it in front of me on the porch, and some part of me had known since the morning he said, "Don't disappoint me." But knowing a thing in your gut and hearing it said by an investigator in the flat language of a case file are different, and I had to hold the porch rail while the second kind of knowing settled into me. My son had not just stolen my name. He had rented out my safety to violent men to buy himself a little more time. He had done the math on my life and decided it was worth less than his next payment. Here is the twist that the men who did the math never saw coming. I did not fall apart. I called Danielle. We had been planning it quietly for 2 weeks, she and I, over calls she made from the grocery store parking lot so he would not see the number. Now I told her it was time that the investigation was real, and moving that safety was no longer something she could wait for. She did it on a Tuesday while Trevor was at what was left of his office. She took Cody and Paige in 2 suitcases and the documents I had coached her to gather, birth certificates, the passports he thought he had hidden, and she drove to a shelter 3 towns over that Brennan had helped arrange, one that specialized in exactly this, in women leaving men who had turned money into a weapon. My grandchildren went to sleep that night in a safe bed for the first time in longer than a child should have to count. And Trevor came home to an empty house for the second time in 3 months, and this time there was no envelope on the table, because this time there was nothing left to say. He came apart. Brennan told me later in the careful way she told me things that when Trevor realized his family was gone and understood finally that the paper trail had a detective standing at the end of it, he stopped being careful. He made calls he should not have made. He threatened people he should not have threatened. And on a gray Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Susan Brennan first called me the Financial Crimes Unit, and 2 officers arrested my son at his office on charges of identity theft, aggravated forgery, and theft by swindle, and they walked him out past the receptionist who had once turned Vivian away, and someone took a photograph, and the next morning it was in the paper. Businessman charged in years-long fraud scheme. The man in the photo wore handcuffs, and my husband's face, and I sat on the porch in Charleston and looked at it for a long time and did not know what I felt because there was no single word for it. Relief and grief standing side by side, holding hands, refusing to let go of each other. He asked to see me. That was the first climax of the whole terrible thing, the moment I had to decide whether the woman who left the note about the R was brave enough to sit across from the man she left it for. Brennan called and told me Trevor was in custody and refusing to speak to anyone, refusing his own lawyer, saying he would talk only to his mother. "You don't have to go," Vivian said, watching my face. "After everything he's done, you owe that man nothing." "I know I don't have to," I said. "That's exactly why I can. I need to look at him once with clear eyes and end it properly. Not run from it. End it." I flew back to Minneapolis for the first time since I left. The jail was a cold gray place with lights that found every line in my tired face. and they brought Trevor into a visiting room in a jumpsuit that made him look smaller and older, and for one instant when he saw me, his eyes filled the way a child's fill, and my whole body remembered the boy in the yellow boots. "Mom," he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. "You came." I sat down across from him and kept my hands folded and kept my distance. "You wanted to see me," I said. "I'm here." He leaned forward fast urgent, and the child went out of his face and the calculation came into it, and I watched the change happen the way you watch weather cross a field. "You don't understand the situation I'm in," he said. "These people I owe Mom, they don't play. If I can't pay them back, they know," I said. And my voice did not shake, and I heard how strange and good that was. "You don't understand the situation you're in, Trevor. I didn't come here to give you money." "That door is closed." I closed it myself and I checked the lock. His face changed again, and this time what came into it was rage. The old cold Whitcomb rage, his father's, and now his. "You abandoned me," he said. "Your own son when I needed you. Is that the story you'll tell my children? That you let their father rot in a cell?" I took a slow breath, and I did not take the bait. And I understood in that moment that not taking the bait was a muscle, and that I had spent 2 years learning to use it, and that it would hold. "I'll tell them the truth," I said, "that their father made a long chain of terrible choices the same way his grandfather did, and that their grandmother finally made a good one." He slammed his cuffed hands flat on the table between us, and the sound cracked around the little room. "The house is in my name," he said. "You have nothing." I stood up. "I have myself," I said, "which is the thing I very nearly lost permanently to men exactly like you and your father." I walked to the door, and then I stopped and I turned around, because there was one more thing, and he needed to hear it from me. "Danielle and the children are safe," I said. "Somewhere you will not find them. They're going to get a chance to start over away from you. And so am I." His eyes when I said it were not a child's eyes. "This isn't over," Trevor said low so the guard would not hear it. "You're going to regret this." I looked at him for a moment longer, the stranger in my son's face, and then I walked out, and the heavy door closed behind me, and for the first time that closing sound felt like mine. I flew back to Charleston believing the worst was behind me. It was not. It was in front of me, and it was worse than anything Trevor had done with a pen, because what he did next, he did with my life. Brennan called me 8 days later, and her calm was different this time, tighter. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "I need you to sit down. There's been a development, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it any other way." From inside the jail awaiting trial, my son had tried to bribe a guard to smuggle in a phone. What he did not know was that the guard was part of an internal integrity operation, and that every word had been recorded. And the call Trevor had wanted the phone for the call he was arranging when the guard he trusted turned out to belong to the state was to one of the private lenders. He was going to give them my address in Charleston. He was going to arrange for someone to come and, in his word, remind me what I owed. He had already named a price for it. $5,000 to a man he had never met to frighten his mother into silence before she could testify. "He didn't want you hurt for its own sake," Brennan said, and she said it gently, as if softness could take the edge off it which it could not. "He wanted you scared. He wanted you to know he still had reach even from a cell, and he was willing to reach through strangers with weapons to prove it." I sat on the porch with the phone in my lap after she hung up, and the marsh went about its business in front of me, the tide sliding in over the mud, the way it had every day. I had lived there, indifferent and clean, and I waited to feel afraid. And the fear came, of course it came a cold thing moving up my spine. But underneath it, holding it up the way a table holds a glass, was something I had not had 2 years before. It was the certainty that I was not that ghost woman anymore, the paper one who signed what she was told and drowned in her own shame, and waited in a house for men to decide her fate. I was Rochelle Whitcomb, who kept books, and who had already killed the paper woman once, and who was not under any circumstances going to be quietly frightened out of a courtroom by the man she had raised. They offered to move me again. Brennan and the Charleston police both. Newtown gated place, fresh start harder to find. Vivian was already on her laptop looking at listings before I finished shaking my head. "No," I said, and I surprised even myself with how flat and final it came out. Vivian looked up. "Rochelle, these are not careful people," she said. "I know exactly what they are," I said. "I've been running from men like this my whole life. I ran out of one house at 68 with a single suitcase, and I would do it again in a heartbeat if running were the answer. But it isn't the answer this time. Running keeps me his. It keeps me the frightened thing he can move around aboard. This is my home. The gray bowls are here. The pool is here. Patsy is here. This is the first address in my life that I chose, and I am not going to let my son take it from me the way his father took everything else, especially not from inside a cell, especially not now. I looked at Vivian, and I said the sentence that decided the rest of it. He wants to send a man to my door to scare me. Then let's be ready for the man at the door. That was the plan, and it was mine and Brennan and a Charleston detective named Alan Pruitt built the frame around it. The two lenders Trevor had contacted were themselves already in trouble, and it turned out that men in trouble will trade a great deal to be in a little less of it, and so quietly they agreed to cooperate. The man they had lined up to come to my door would still come, but everyone who mattered would know he was coming. Detective Pruitt walked me through it in Vivian's front room, patient thorough-treating me, not like a frightened old woman to be managed, but like what I had become a competent partner in my own defense. You keep your normal routine, he said. The market, the pool, you change nothing. We'll be closer than you can see. When he comes, and he will come, you don't have to do anything but be yourself and open the door. We do the rest, and I understood that I was not bait in the way a helpless thing is bait. I was the woman who had drawn the map that everyone else was now standing on. For 3 days I lived inside my own ordinary life, while a net closed slowly around it. I threw bowls in the back room. I swam my cold morning laps and let Patsy talk me into coffee. I sold a marsh green pitcher to a tourist who had no idea she was buying it 3 feet from a plainclothes officer pretending to browse the next table. Every stranger on the sidewalk made the hair rise on my arms. And every night I lay in the spare room of the butter-yellow house and listened to the water and reminded myself that fear is a passenger, not a driver, and that I had my hands on the wheel now, and I was not letting go. On the morning of the 4th day, I was on the porch, watering the ferns in my housecoat. My hair not yet done as ordinary a picture of a harmless old woman as anyone could ask for when I looked up and saw a man across the street leaning against a light pole, not walking, not waiting for anyone, just watching my door. Our eyes met for half a second. Then I turned unhurried, the way you turn when you have nothing to hide and nothing to fear, and I carried my watering can back inside and I set it down, and I looked at Detective Pruitt, who was sitting at Vivian's kitchen table in a delivery driver's shirt, and I said very quietly, "He's here." He watched the house for the better part of an hour. I made myself stay ordinary. I did my hair. I made tea I did not drink. Detective Pruitt sat at Vivian's kitchen table in his delivery shirt and did not move and did not hurry, and his stillness taught me something about the difference between fear and readiness, which is that they feel almost the same in the body, but point in opposite directions. Then, a little after 10, the man pushed off the light pole and crossed the street toward my door. Unhurried, a plain, forgettable man who could stand in any crowd and never be seen, which I suppose was the point of hiring him. He came up the porch steps. He knocked. I looked at Pruitt, and Pruitt gave me one small nod, and I walked to the door and opened it with the chain off, because we had decided that a frightened woman would leave the chain on, and I was not going to give him a frightened woman. "Rochelle Whitcomb," the man said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. "I have a message for you," he said, "from your son." And that was as far as he got, because he had said the one sentence the whole net had been waiting for, the sentence that turned a man on a porch into a man committing a crime. And before his hand could finish moving toward his jacket, Detective Pruitt and 2 officers came through the door and around the side of the porch and had him against the rail. He did not fight. He seemed, if anything, almost relieved, the way a man looks when a thing he knew was wrong is finally taken out of his hands. They read him his rights on my porch in the salt air with the ferns dripping, and I stood in my own doorway and watched it happen and did not look away. He told them everything that afternoon. Trevor had promised him $5,000 wired through the lenders to come to my door, break a few things where I would see them broken, say a few things I would not be able to unhear and leave a mark on me that would not send me to a hospital, but would make me afraid to ever sit in a witness chair. Nothing fatal, Pruitt told me later, choosing his words, but enough that you'd never feel safe in your own home again. I sat down when he said it because my legs asked me to. "Is it enough?" I asked, "for new charges?" "It is," Pruitt said. "Solicitation, conspiracy, tampering with a witness. In Minnesota, those run on top of the fraud, not inside it. Your son didn't just deepen his hole, Mrs. Whitcomb. He dug a second one next to it and jumped in. The trial came in the spring in Minneapolis, and I flew north to sit in it. I want to tell you it was dramatic, that there were gasps and a gavel and a single perfect moment of justice. It was not like that. It was slow and procedural, and mostly it was numbers. My numbers read into the record by people in gray suits. The ghost woman Trevor had built taken apart in public, one account at a time. I testified. I sat in the box and told the truth in plain words. I told them about the morning he handed me the file. I told them about the funeral flowers and the power of attorney I signed without reading. I told them about the R. Trevor's lawyer, a polished man named Dennis Halloway, stood up for his turn and asked me in a voice like warm oil whether I considered myself a good mother. The prosecutor started to object, and I raised my hand a little because I wanted this one. For most of my life, I said I believed being a good mother meant giving my son everything. My money, my time, my own name to sign away. I was wrong. Being a good mother also means letting a grown man meet the consequences of the things he chose. I stopped protecting him from himself. That is not abandonment, sir. That is the first honest thing I ever did as his mother. Other people testified too, and this was the part that undid whatever was left of Halloway's story, that Trevor was just a businessman who had a bad year, homeowners who had lost deposits to his failing developments, a contractor never paid, and Danielle, calm and thin and steady, who described years of a house run on lies and locked accounts, and a man who treated the people who loved him as line items. I watched my son through all of it, and I watched him understand slowly that there was no version of the story left that would save him, and I watched the rage in him curdle into something quieter and more frightened, and I did not enjoy it, and I did not look away from it either. The judge found him guilty on all of it. The fraud because the paper did not lie and the R did not lie, and the solicitation and the tampering because a man he had never met had stood on my porch and said the words. Under the sentencing guidelines, the fraud alone with that many victims and that much money was already years. The witness tampering and conspiracy running consecutive because he committed them from inside a cell against the very witness whose testimony he feared added more. When it was totaled, the judge sentenced my son to 14 years with the possibility of supervised release after he had served a substantial part of it, the way Minnesota does it, no parole board to charm, just time and behavior in time. Trevor did not look at me when they let him out. He looked at the floor. I think that was the first honest thing he did in that courtroom. I went back to Charleston believing the story was over, and that is when the story finally told me what it had been about the whole time. She came to the market on a Saturday in early summer. I had my half table set up, the gray bowls and the marsh green pitchers laid out on a cloth, and I looked up from making change to find a woman standing there not looking at the pottery at all, but at me. She was older than me, past 70, with silver hair pinned back, and a face that seemed in some way I could not place familiar. "Rochelle Whitcomb," she said. "Yes," I said. "My name is Deborah," she said. "Deborah Kessler." And then when I did not react because the name meant nothing to me, she said it plainly, the way you set down something heavy. "I was married to Gerald. Before you. I had known in the vague way you know things you are encouraged not to look at that Gerald had a first wife. He mentioned her rarely, and only to call her unstable, obsessed with money, a woman who had made his life a misery until he was free of her. I had accepted that the way I accepted everything he told me in those years because looking closely was dangerous. Now the woman herself stood in front of me at a folding table, and I invited her back to the butter yellow house, and I made her tea, and she told me the truth that Gerald had spent decades painting over. "He did to me exactly what your son did to you," Deborah said. 35 years ago, before there were words for it. He controlled every dollar. He told me I was hopeless with money until I believed it. He isolated me from my sister, my friends, until the only voice I trusted about my own life was his. And when I finally got out, he made sure I left with almost nothing, and then he told everyone who would listen that I was unstable and obsessed with money and impossible to live with. She smiled, and there was no bitterness left in it, only a long, worn tiredness. It took me 20 years to understand that a woman is not obsessed with money when a man has spent a decade using money to cage her. She is just at last paying attention. I have spent a long time paying attention since. And then she said the thing that broke me open. When I read about your son in the news, and then when the news mentioned you, the widow who left, who moved her own money and stood in a courtroom against her own child, I found that I could not stop thinking about you. There are groups now, Rochelle, networks of us. Women who were told they were crazy for wanting to understand their own bank accounts. Your name has been moving through them for months. You have no idea, do you? You have become a kind of proof. Proof of what I asked, though, I think I already knew. Proof that it is possible, Deborah said, to walk out. At any age. Even when the man is your own son. Even when everyone has spent your whole life telling you that you are the problem for noticing. There are women out there right now sitting in kitchens they are afraid to leave, and some of them have heard the story of the woman who kept books, and it is the first time in years they have let themselves imagine a door. I sat with that for a long time after she left out on the porch, the tide coming in. Gerald had built Trevor. That was the cold thread that ran all the way down. My husband had trained my son in cruelty the way another father might teach a boy to fish patiently by example at the kitchen table. And I had spent 30 years not looking, and the not looking had been its own kind of teaching. The cycle went back further than my own marriage, back at least to a young woman named Deborah, who had been called unstable for the crime of counting. And it would have gone forward too into Cody, into how Paige someday let a man speak to her, if it had not at long last in a butter-yellow house by the harbor been broken by a 68-year-old woman with a suitcase and a friend who read contracts. I want to tell you plainly where the money went because people always wonder, and because the honest accounting matters to me now more than it ever did. The $325,000 I moved that first morning did not make me rich. It bought me my life. A great deal of it went to the lawyers to Vivian's colleagues and the forensic accountant and the 2 years of quiet, expensive work it takes to unmake a fraud and prove a name. Some of it went to security to the cameras and the reinforced locks, and the months when I needed to be safe more than I needed to be thrifty. And a good part of what was left I gave away on purpose. I used it to seed something. Because Deborah was right that there were women in kitchens they were afraid to leave, and I had money, and I had a name that was apparently moving through networks I had never joined, and it seemed to me that the most fitting thing I could possibly do with the money a man tried to trap me with was to spend it building doors for other women to walk through. We called it Steady Ground. Vivian did the paperwork. Deborah joined the board. It is a small nonprofit run out of a small office downtown, and it does one thing well. It helps women who have been controlled through money learn to read their own accounts, protect their own names, and leave if leaving is what they need to do. Twice a week, we hold free financial workshops, the kind of plain instruction no one ever gave me. How to read a credit report, how to spot a signature that is almost but not quite yours, how to revoke a power of attorney you signed in grief. I made our logo myself in clay and cast it into a small tile we give to every woman who finishes the first workshop. It is a phoenix, which I know is not original, but some images are common because they are true. Danielle collaborates now when she can, driving in from the town where she and the children have rebuilt, telling her own story to rooms full of women who need to hear that the young ones get out too. Cody and Paige come to Charleston every summer now. Cody, who is 10 fishes off the pier and brings me back nothing, and is very proud of it. Paige, who is 8, sits beside me at the wheel with a towel over her lap and makes small lopsided bowls, and last summer she looked up at me with clay to her elbows and asked me, "Grandma, are you happy now?" I stopped the wheel. I looked at her serious little face. "Yes, honey," I said. "Happier than I have ever been in my life." Even without Grandpa and Daddy, she asked in the careful way children ask the enormous questions. I chose my words the way I choose glaze. Sometimes, Paige, I said we have to step away from people we love in order to find ourselves. It doesn't mean we stop loving them. It means we finally start loving ourselves too. She thought about that, her small eyebrows drawing together, and then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to her bowl, and I have never in my life given a piece of testimony I was prouder of. Trevor writes to me from prison. The first letter came almost a year in, and I braced for the old machinery, the plea and the threat, and it did not come. He wrote that he was in a program that a therapist there had walked him back through his own childhood and shown him the pattern, how he had learned to see people as accounts, to be drawn on how he had learned it from a father at a kitchen table, the same table where I learned to stop looking. He did not ask for anything. He did not ask for forgiveness, which is the only reason I believed a word of it. I saw your picture in the paper he wrote speaking to those women. You looked like someone I never got to meet. I did not answer for a long time, and when I finally did, I kept it short, and I kept it true. I told him I could not offer trust, because trust once broken is a long road back, and I had no way to know if he was walking it or only describing it. But I told him I was glad he was looking at the pattern, because the pattern is the whole case in a courtroom and in a life. I told him that my door was closed and would stay closed, and that this was not cruelty, but the only ground on which anything honest could ever someday grow between us if it grew at all. I signed it Rochelle, not Mom. He had lost the right to summon me with that word, and I had lost the need to answer to it. I keep a journal now, another thing I learned late. On the evening after Paige asked me if I was happy, I sat on the porch with it open on my knee, and the sky going orange and purple over the marsh. And I wrote down the truest thing I had learned so that I would have it if I ever forgot. I wrote that for almost 70 years I had tried to be what other people needed me to be. A quiet wife, a generous mother, a signature at the bottom of a page, and that the morning my son slid a debt across my table and told me not to disappoint him was the morning I finally understood that I had been disappointing only one person my entire life, and it was not him, and it was not his father. It was the woman who kept books and had let herself be told she could not count. I wrote that the money he took I would never fully get back, and the 32 years I gave to a marriage that made me small I could not have returned. But that the time I had left was mine, all of it, to spend as I chose, without permission, without apology, without fear. And I wrote the thing I say now at the end of every workshop to every room of frightened women who remind me of myself at every age I ever was. It is never too late to say no. It is never too late to pick up your own name and carry it out the door. And it is never ever too late to find out who you are when you finally stop living for someone else's approval. At 68, I thought my story was ending. I was wrong about that the way I had been wrong about so much. It was not ending. It was for the first time beginning to be mine. The doorbell rang. I set the journal down. Through the window I could see Vivian on the porch with a bottle of wine, and Deborah just behind her, and Patsy coming up the walk still in her swim things, and the low gold light lying over all of them like something forgiven. "What are we celebrating?" I called through the screen, though I already knew. 3 years, Vivian said, since you said no. 3 years of it being your own life. I came out onto the porch and someone put a glass in my hand, and out past the seawall the tide was turning again, coming in patient and certain and clean. "To courage," Vivian said, raising her glass. "No," I said, and I looked at the 3 of them and then out at the water that had become the truest friend of my old age. "To counting." And we drank to that, the 4 of us under a sky, the color of a bruise healing, while somewhere far to the north a man served his time, and somewhere closer a young woman slept safe with her children, and here, on a porch, she had chosen an old woman who had finally learned to read her own life all the way to the last line, raised a glass she had made with her own 2 hands.